Hearing of the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations and Related Programs of the United States Senate Appropriations Committee will come to order. Mr. Nathan, we are grateful that you are joining us today. We will have one witness today, Scott Nathan, CEO of the Development Finance Corporation. I'll make some brief opening remarks. I believe my ranking member will join us by then, but if not, we'll then proceed with your opening testimony and then proceed to a round of questions of the members of the subcommittee. We meet in a moment when nationally we are facing the challenge of how do we sustain American competitiveness, how do we strengthen our place in the world, and how do we respond to recovery from the pandemic, to economic growth opportunities all across the world, and how do we sharpen and modernize America's development tools. This hearing is an opportunity to review the successes, challenges, and lessons learned for the Development Finance Corporation and to discuss ways we can help strengthen the DFC's implementation of its mandates. I have also invited the DFC Inspector General to submit testimony, which I will review and will be included in the hearing record. Some of our colleagues have scheduling conflicts, but I thought it was critical we hold this hearing today as we are working on drafting appropriations bills and other critically relevant legislation for the Development Finance Corporation. First, a quick word on the House Appropriations Committee allocations, which concern many of us, given the proposed deep cuts across agencies, including those funded by this subcommittee. I've worked with Chair Granger in the past, and I'm looking forward to working with Chair Diaz-Balart in his new role as the House SFOP's chair. They are serious appropriators, and we share many priorities. We don't yet have the full picture of the resources or legislative provisions that may be included in the House SFOP's bill, but we do know the initial allocations include deep cuts, a cut of about 33% to the SFOP's allocation. The consequences of that, I think, would be grave. Underinvesting in our global diplomatic and development professional workforce, failing to pay our treaty dues on time, failing to provide credible alternatives to countries seeking development finance, investment in infrastructure and modernization, stepping back from our global leadership in confronting Russian aggression, countering PRC economic coercion, and addressing truly global threats to stability like terrorism, corruption, and climate change. I don't think we can compete globally and do our job by the American people by slashing funding and turning inward. This will make for a particularly challenging and engaging appropriations process between the House and the Senate. Moving on to today's topic, the DFC was established through strong bipartisan support for modernizing U.S. foreign assistance. It was broadly recognized at the time many of us worked on the BUILD Act that by expanding the tools we have for leveraging private sector capital, we could achieve a greater impact on development and advance our broader foreign policy objectives. We also thought it was important to provide more opportunities for higher quality investment so that partner countries would not be susceptible to relying on coercive lending from other countries, principally the PRC, which across dozens of countries has too often been the only choice in emerging markets for rapid financing or access to large infrastructure investments. I am optimistic about the DFC's trajectory in seeking to meet these objectives as you approach your fifth year in 2024. Over the relatively brief time that the DFC has been operational with its current authorities and mission and mandate, including under two administrations with some significant differences in the administration's priorities, I've been impressed with the DFC's progress in using the new tools provided by Congress. Fiscal year 22 set a record for DFC investment with over $7 billion committed to offer values-driven and high-quality alternatives and to drive investment in economic growth and development where it's most needed in the world. What matters more than the dollars is the projects themselves. You have worked to ensure that there's critical investment in energy transitions, in critical mineral supply chains, tackling food insecurity, facilitating responses to the COVID-19 pandemic globally by making available vaccines and investing in vaccine production, increasing capital access in countries plagued by economic crisis like Sri Lanka and in Ukraine, where Russia's war has had a devastating impact on its economy. There are so many more, and we look forward to hearing from you about them. To be clear, I didn't play a role in creating the DFC, imagining it would be a panacea to all of our global challenges. I have no illusions about the complexity of your work, but we look forward to working with you to take the next steps required to strengthen the DFC. I do hope to hear from you about planned internal reorganization and how you're working to strengthen the overall strategic direction of the corporation and communicating your priorities and your response to those who feel that DFC has been too slow to engage in either critical sectors or regions, including, in particular, the Indo-Pacific. I look forward to getting your perspective on some of the specific legislative reforms that I am pursuing with colleagues, such as ensuring you can fully leverage your equity investments as Congress intended, and potentially expanding country eligibility. So, Mr. Nathan, thank you for joining us. We have a great deal to discuss. I am not anticipating the imminent arrival of my ranking member, and so let me briefly introduce you to the other member of the subcommittee who's with us. Scott Nathan, you are someone who has served in public life for quite a period of time, educated at Harvard and Harvard Law School. We most recently met when you were working for the White House Office of Presidential Personnel, helping manage the transition adroitly. I very much look forward to your testimony and welcome the members of the committee who have joined us. Mr. Nathan, if you'd address the subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Coons, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. I want to start by thanking Congress, and especially this committee, for its continued support of DFC. You have helped strengthen our ability to fulfill our mission, drive positive development impact, and advance the foreign policy interests of the United States. I'm proud of the progress DFC has made in increasing its investments and impact, both developmental and strategic. Last year, DFC committed over $7.4 billion through 183 transactions in 111 countries. That was a great result, but DFC can drive even greater impact as we build our capacity, execute on our strategy, and work more effectively with our partners. For FY 2024, the administration requests a budget of $1.023 billion for DFC, a 2.3% increase over last year's request. Included in that total is $780 million in program funds, unchanged from last year, and $243 million in administrative expenses, an increase of $23 million. The requested increase in administrative resources will allow DFC to meet critical staffing needs, bolster business development efforts, and increase our overseas engagement. DFC is working to be more proactive across our operations, refocusing our efforts on our highest priority sectors where there are enduring needs: infrastructure, energy, health and agriculture, and small business support. DFC focuses on working with the private sector because closing the $40 trillion global infrastructure financing gap is beyond the capacity of any single development finance institution or single state actor. The PRC focuses on lending at the sovereign level, frequently burdening communities with projects that are overpriced, poor quality, and unsuitable for local conditions. This often saddles developing countries with too much debt and disappointing results. DFC offers a choice. Our investments carry our values of openness, respect for local laws and conditions, and high environmental, labor, and quality standards. DFC's work enhances the long-term sustainability of our projects, amplifies development impact, and guards against the danger that projects will harm local populations. DFC is committed to making high-quality investments in seaports, airports, railways, and road networks that connect communities to the opportunities of the global marketplace. For example, earlier this year, DFC invested $150 million in the expansion of the Yilport terminal in Ecuador. And earlier this month, DFC's board approved a loan that supports the expansion and modernization of an airport in Sierra Leone, providing one of the world's poorest countries stronger connections to its region and to the world. At the same time, DFC is also investing to strengthen 21st century infrastructure, working with the private sector to bolster digital connections and networks that are secure, safe, and open. In Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya, DFC is supporting Africa Data Centers, a company investing in information technology infrastructure. And in the Indo-Pacific region, DFC worked with our Australian and Japanese counterparts to support Telstra's acquisition of cellular and digital networks in Papua New Guinea and 5 other Pacific Island nations. DFC is also investing to secure supply chains for critical minerals. As you know, the PRC has made it a priority to attempt to control these supply chains, from mining to processing. With an additional $30 million equity investment into TechMet Limited, a U.S.-aligned critical minerals platform, DFC is helping to secure access to nickel and cobalt through an innovative project in Brazil. I'm optimistic that our relationship with TechMet will lead to many additional opportunities. DFC is focused on providing affordable, reliable, and sustainable access to energy, a critical factor in development and economic security. In India, DFC is pursuing several transactions that will diversify the solar manufacturing supply chain away from PRC dominance. Last year, DFC provided $500 million in debt financing to First Solar for the construction of a new plant. Across a range of technologies, DFC is working to provide reliable access to power for communities in countries ranging from Sierra Leone and Malawi to Nigeria and Ecuador. We're pursuing new opportunities in nuclear energy, e-mobility businesses, and supply chains that support them. In response to Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, DFC is also helping to drive greater diversity and resilience in energy supply in Central Europe and the Caucasus. In Bulgaria, Georgia, Moldova, and Poland, DFC has projects that will diversify power supplies away from Russian gas and stabilize electricity grids. Russia's war against Ukraine has also endangered food security around the globe, and in response, last year, DFC surged efforts in the food and agriculture sector. Investments in resilient healthcare systems provide a necessary foundation for the development of a vibrant private sector and help prepare for future health crises. For example, in Vietnam, DFC is investing to help expand access to clinics and pharmaceutical products in rural areas. DFC is also committed to providing support for the small businesses that are the engines of so many economies. We have recently made investments focused on expanding access to capital for SMEs in Egypt, El Salvador, Honduras, Jordan, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, amongst many others. And none of these deals are easy, but all of these countries and investments are strategically important to the United States. DFC has a unique complement of products and tools that can help drive the private sector investment to make development impact. However, current budgetary rules for equity scoring prevent DFC from taking full advantage of this important tool that Congress gave us in the BUILD Act. I imagine we'll address this further during the questions. I want DFC to be strategic and focused where we make investments and to be held accountable for our performance. The administration's funding request allows us to build our workforce, grow our capacity, and align our organizational structure to drive greater impact. Thank you for your support, which makes this work possible, and for your continued commitment to helping DFC achieve even more. I look forward to continue to work with this committee, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nathan. We're now going to move to probably one round of 7-minute questions, and if there's members who persist, be happy to do a second round. I wanted to ask, if I could, when we established the DFC in 2019, it was with a mandate to mobilize private capital in support of development goals and sustainable economic growth to help further our foreign policy interests. Some of the stakeholders of the DFC want you to focus more of your attention on poverty reduction in less developed countries, while others are urging a shift towards critical geostrategic investments. To what extent is this a zero-sum trade-off between poverty alleviation and strategic impact? Is that real, or is that a perception? And how are you ensuring the DFC is maximizing resources to deliver on the full scope of its mandate? How do you prioritize if this is, in fact, a real trade-off?
So the BUILD Act clearly gave us a dual mission: to make development impact in the poorest countries of the world and to advance the strategic and foreign policy interests of the United States. And I think we can do both. We can do both through all of our transactions. Both elements of our mission are mutually reinforcing. I don't see them as contradictory in any way.
Please continue, Mr.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Every time Senator Graham shows up, it's a shock to the system. Literally.
So I see the two elements of our mission as strongly reinforcing of one another. And you can see this through our projects. A project like I mentioned, Yulport, critically important from a strategic point of view to give Ecuador a deep water port on the Pacific. It's important that we were there to finance that rather than our strategic competitors. But that project also produces 1,250 jobs locally. It provides connections to markets around the world for Ecuador, which is a key to their economic growth. So even a project that can be viewed as purely strategic has huge developmental impact. And the same is true in terms of the small and very important, highly developmental projects we do that make a difference in remote communities. That helps with economic growth and stability. That's good for the United States. That's good for our interests.
What I mostly hear when I travel to other countries, Senator Graham and I traveled to a number of countries in Africa together a few months ago, is they want more. They want more of the DFC. They want more of your leveraging American private capital. They want more of having an alternative to, as you put it, PRC investment that often produces too much debt and disappointing results. There are legislative changes that a number of us are advocating for that would allow you to leverage funds more effectively. One would fix the equity scoring issue. The other would expand country eligibility rather than just relying on World Bank income categories. A similar change is being considered for the MCC. What would the impact of these two changes be? And could you provide some examples of equity investments you've had to pass on which could have helped us geostrategically with countering the PRC and with development had the equity scoring problem been solved?
Thank you for the question. It's very clear that in the BUILD Act, the expansion of our toolkit to include equity was one of the key elements of making us be able to be more forward-leaning on risk. Our predecessor agencies, particularly OPIC, were constrained in their ability to take risk in projects, partially by the way that they were structured and funded, but also because they were unable to use equity as a tool. That made it difficult to partner with our colleagues at other development finance institutions with the G7 and other allies. And it meant that there were projects that were earlier in the life cycle, or in countries, low-income countries, there's reasons why there's not robust financing markets on the debt side. Equity is a more long-term, patient tool. The way that I think equity, if we had the expanded ability to use it, would be valuable to our mission, in particular, would be able to be earlier in projects, even infrastructure and energy projects, where we could support developers, help influence their choices of vendors and EPC contractors, other shareholders or sources of finance, to make sure they make the right choice. You're right, when I travel, I hear, like you did, that people want us to show up. They're looking for diversity in their relationships. They're looking for choice. But if we don't have an offering that fits their needs, we won't be able to offer that kind of choice.
I'm struck that both the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was an innovation of the Bush administration and approaches development with metrics, accountability, long-term goals, and the DFC, whose principal goal is crowding in private capital and deploying the best of the American private sector and delivering more transparent, more sustainable, better, are both funded at about $1 billion in a government that, in terms of our engagement with the world, between defense and development, diplomacy, does hundreds of times more than that. I'm excited to have a chance to work with you and my colleagues on trying to fix the equity scoring issue. What would that fix do to your leverage and your reach and your scope?
So at the moment, our ability to make equity investments, because they're accounted for on a dollar-for-dollar basis, as if immediately it's as if we lost the money. It's accounted for more like a grant than an investment. We're not able to get the kind of leverage that we do with our debt transactions. On an appropriation last year of $500 million of program funds, we made $7.4 billion of investments. But the amount of equity we could use was quite limited as a result. If we had a bigger pot of equity, we could look at making $100 million or $200 million investments in precisely the kind of projects that I mentioned: big infrastructure, mining of critical minerals, energy projects, where we could be early and influence the direction that those projects are taking, as opposed to coming all the way at the end with debt financing.
And just for those who may not be familiar with how the stacking and the structuring works, if you're equity, you help drive the deal.
That's right.
If you're debt, you're the caboose.
With equity, we would have a seat at the table. We'd be able to be far more patient. We'd be able to operate in environments that are more difficult, more complex, and riskier.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony. My ranking member, Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Number one, a brief opening statement here. If you're really serious about countering China, and we all are, you have to show up. You have to show up and offer to people in the world an alternative to Belt and Road.
Yeah.
This program, the DFC, is sort of like the best thing we have going for us right now. And $1 billion, it should be multiple times that. And what the chairman is trying to do, and no matter who wins in 2024, we're going to be partners on this issue. Senator Sheen's been great. All of our colleagues up here sort of get that you're not going to compete with China through a lens of isolationism. Why are we spending money over there? Well, because people over there affect the quality of life over here. If you want to stop illegal immigration, let's improve the quality of life in places where people are coming from. If you forgot 9/11, which was over there, I haven't, taking your eye off the ball can really lead to a lot of money and lives being lost. So without some soft power, as General Mattis said, you better buy a lot more bullets, because if you don't show up and turn things around before it's too late, you wind up getting sucked into military conflict, or you lose influence in a world that China is trying to dominate. So the equity aspect of this makes perfect sense to me, Mr. Chairman. The goal is to run this more like a business. We have the former ambassador to Japan here. We are going to have to redesign and reimagine foreign assistance. The MCC, the DFC, the fragile state approach, the food security conservation fund, where you're having the private sector put serious money involved and the government partners up, is the only way to get outcomes. So I want to applaud you, Mr. Chairman. You're trying to make this program more efficient, to get a better return on taxpayer dollar, and equity investment should be allowed. I'm worried about the World Bank income classification being our guide, taking areas of the world off the table that it's in our strategic national security interest to be involved in. It should be about what's best for us. It's not what the World Bank does in terms of income rating, so I'd like to change that. To my colleagues here, don't tell me about how tough you're on China if you're going to let Ukraine fail. You're not. If you don't see the need to support Ukraine then, related to China, you're missing a lot. Don't tell me we're going to be tough on China if you don't have something like the DFC to compete with the Belt Road Initiative. So this subcommittee, I think, has done really good work in this space. President Bush started it. President Trump continued along these lines. Even though he cut the account dramatically, these are one of the programs he saw value in. And I want to support President Biden's effort to grow the footprint here. So the bottom line for me is that this is a program worth investing in at a higher level, taking some of the limitations off the program to get maximum benefit should be our goal in 2024. And I'll end with one question, basically. Mr. Nathan, is China your chief competitor in the spaces that you deal in through the DFC portfolio? And what would happen if this program went away vis-a-vis China's ability to influence the world at a greater level?
Senator, thank you for the question, and thank you especially for your comments before that. I wholeheartedly agree with what you said. So it's clear in the markets where we operate, China is the major actor, the major source of finance through the Belt and Road Initiative, through their development banks. The offering of finance at terms that often end up creating problems for the countries down the road that accepted them. It's clear you can't blame countries for looking for financing to build their economies and support the infrastructure in their countries, but it often comes with strings attached or is inappropriate, poor quality. What we do at DFC is different than what China does. There are many reasons for that. The first is we support the private sector. I'm a strong believer that the best engine for alleviating poverty around the world is a robust economy and a robust private sector. We also adhere to extremely high standards. We're offering projects that countries want, that are appropriate for their local conditions and their laws, that have passed through very important screening for labor conditions, environmental standards, for know your customer. We care about corruption. These are things where we offer something not only that's a choice, but that is different and I believe is better. And if we weren't on the playing field, I hear this all the time when I travel, that countries are impatient. They obviously are looking to support the welfare of their people, but they want a diversity of relationships.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and to you, Mr. Nathan, thank you for being here and for the work you're doing every day. I share Senator Graham's sentiments about not limiting where we invest to just those countries that are designated by the World Bank, because there are places that both need investment and have strategic interests for the United States. One of those areas, I would argue, is the Western Balkans, which I have been focused on for a number of years, and one of the places where I think we should consider opening a DFC office somewhere in the region because of its significance, both for a Europe that we want to see whole, free, and at peace, but also because it is an area that is ripe for interference by both the Russians and the Chinese. And one of the examples that I have here is from Montenegro, which signed a nearly $1 billion Belt and Road deal with the China Road and Bridge Corporation, with funding from the Export-Import Bank of China, to build a road that would have connected the north and south of the country. Now, you can see the current status of the project in red. That's where the project is completed, but the blue parts highlight the still incomplete sections of the project, and I think this is a poster example of what you were talking about in your opening statement about the limits of the PRC's investments. I mean, sadly, despite the fact that this project has not gone forward as it was supposed to, Montenegro has now signed yet another infrastructure deal with China. That happened in March when the government signed a deal worth $59 million with a PRC consortium to build a new road. But it's my understanding that there were no U.S. or European firms who submitted bids. So can you talk about why that would have happened, that there were no other viable offers from the U.S., and what lessons we should take from this kind of situation?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I don't know the specifics of why the tender in Montenegro failed. I think I can generalize to the kind of situations that I see in many of the countries where DFC operates. You know, we focus on the private sector, so the projects that we fund need to be commercially viable, need to offer an opportunity for a return from the sponsors, where we would provide debt financing or potentially make an equity investment. And I think what frequently happens in these government projects that are then tendered is there's an opportunity, and I don't know in this particular case, but in general, there's an opportunity for corruption, for projects that don't really fit the needs. What happens when Chinese firms come in is frequently they use their own workers. They end up burdening the country at the sovereign level with debt that's difficult to manage. We're avoiding that by focusing on the private sector and viable projects. And I heard yesterday about a South American country where Huawei had built the 911 emergency call system that needs to be rebooted every 4 hours. And so it goes offline for an hour. All the manuals are in Chinese, and the country can't use it. So they're launching a new tender. I'm hopeful that American companies will step in, that companies from allied countries and our partners will also step in order to provide these services. But it's true, particularly when I'm in Africa, one of the things that you rarely see are U.S. companies that are there to compete. And that, I think, is a broader issue, but one I would love to see EPC contractors, the firms that build infrastructure, be more broadly representative of America and Europe.
I agree, and one of the things we've got to do is to remind those countries that are looking for investments the trap that the PRC can create for them, as they did for Montenegro. Last year, the DFC announced a deal to provide up to $300 million in financing to the 3Cs Investment Fund, which is supposed to invest in transportation, energy, digital infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe. It's my understanding that despite the strong bipartisan support for this investment, that negotiations have still not been finalized. Can you give us an update on where those are and when you expect them to be completed?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I was delighted last year, I think it was in June, to lead the U.S. delegation to the 3Cs Initiative Summit. The 3Cs Initiative is incredibly important in terms of strengthening our partners and allies in Central Europe. It's about economic connectivity, something that I'm a strong believer in. At that conference, we announced that we would be making a commitment to the fund. We're already working with the fund and throughout the region to find investments that we can make directly. We're in the final stages of negotiation with the fund manager for that fund. There are still some sticking points in the negotiation that are important from our side in terms of protecting the taxpayer interests in how the fund is structured. But I'm hopeful that we can get that fund across the finish line in short order. The bigger picture is this is a region where we're actively looking for projects. The European Energy Security and Diversification Act authorizes us to focus on energy infrastructure, and we have some very good projects in the pipeline and have already made a few in the region.
That's good to hear. One of the other areas, I chair the European Affairs Subcommittee of Foreign Relations, and so that's where I have been mostly focused. And one of the other areas I know that is ripe for investment is telecommunications, and we hear particularly from Eastern European countries about their interest in getting investment to help them so that they're not reliant on China or other countries for telecommunications. Is the DFC currently involved in any telecommunications projects in Eastern Europe?
So in the high-income countries of Eastern Europe, which is the vast majority of them, we're not currently authorized to work on telecommunication investments.
I actually have legislation that I introduced in 22 that would authorize the DFC to invest in those kind of telecommunications projects because they are so critical. So hopefully we will revisit that legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to my colleague, Senator Shaheen, both for the way that you bring your experience and strength and skills across several different committees, but also your persistent focus in a critical part of Eastern and Central Europe. It is greatly appreciated. Senator Haggerty, we very much look forward to your questioning.
Chairman Coons, thank you very much for your remarks. I think that all of you will find that I'm in violent agreement with everything that has been said, and I look forward to working with you on making some continued improvements. And Senator Shaheen, I could not agree with you more about the criticality of telecommunications infrastructure, particularly given the difficulties that we've had with Huawei, ZTE, and others that are trying to invade the entire 5G infrastructure system. I'd like to just step back for a moment, Mr. Nathan. I think you know a little bit of the history, but for my colleagues, I'd like to share the fact that I have some parental pride in what you're doing, because the design of what has now become the Development Finance Corporation was something I was deeply involved in as we transformed from the old OPIC to what you're leading right now. And at that point, we made some significant modifications in terms of what you're allowed to do, equity investment, for example. I don't think any of us, particularly people with business background, imagine that we got it exactly right. But I think that what we would hope to see is the ability to continue to improve. As you learn, as you try to deploy the funds that we've given you, finding rules that will help make you more and more effective. So I'm glad that this conversation is happening right now in terms of how we can get it done. I'll say another critical aspect of having the ability to improve is having individuals like yourself who have the relevant private sector experience and know how to invest. And I think we benefit from your experience, your predecessors like Adam Bowler and Ray Washburn. Having that type of business DNA makes your organization much more effective, and I think it makes us much more inclined to work with you to improve the various parameters that you've been given to operate so that you can become even more effective. One thing that you mentioned is that the best recipe for alleviating poverty, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, was a robust economy and a robust private sector. And I would just add to that that it's also the best means to ensure economic security and national security when we have both of those elements. I hope that you'll have that emblazoned and put on the wall there at the Development Finance Corporation, because I admire your words and agree with them with that slight addition. I'd like to step back and share just some observations from a trip I recently took, and I think I spoke with you before I undertook the trip to Chile, to Uruguay, to Colombia. I just left this morning a conference, an ASEAN-US Business Council conference. Everywhere we go, talking to leaders, we realize something very basic. They're trying to recover from the devastation of the coronavirus pandemic. Their economies are facing serious headwinds. Their debt burdens have increased. Social upheaval exists everywhere. Frankly, crime is up in each of the countries that I speak with. These are very real challenges. And you've got countries that are operating at the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're trying to put food on the table right now. And as I look at the DFC investment portfolio, what I see are a number of projects that are oriented toward lofty goals, but with ESG parameters on them. We're investing in billions of dollars in climate change projects, solar panels that require endless government subsidies. We're even doing a project in South Africa on equitable taxi transportation. So I'm trying to understand how you prioritize projects, particularly given the competitive environment that we're in, and this has been mentioned, I think, very clearly. We're competing every day. You've acknowledged who our top competitor is, and that's the CCP. How do you prioritize these projects?
Well, thank you for your comments and for your question, Senator. So we've been engaged in a process at DFC of thinking about, now that DFC is fully launched, is 3 years into operation, about how to refine our statement of priorities. And I mentioned them in my testimony. It reflects the areas that we've been working in, and I think they're broad and enduring enough that from administration to administration, they should be in place. That's infrastructure, energy, healthcare, agriculture and food, and support for small business. This is the 5 areas that if you look across our portfolio, it's 85, 90% of the activity that we do, and it should be where we're focusing our business development efforts, our client management efforts, trying to bring our whole toolkit of solutions to clients in that area to make a difference in infrastructure, energy, healthcare, food and ag, and small business support.
Well, I think that the countries that we're targeting to partner with will be most receptive if you focus on the very basic deliverables here, and the aspirational projects that may have some benefit at the higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy, I think should be reprioritized. I just want to get that point across. The second point has been emphasized earlier before, and that's the utilization of income-based criteria for the countries that you work in. I had a very frustrating conversation with the president of Uruguay, who really wants to work with us, yet our rules make it impossible for him to do so. So his only alternative is to, as he told me, to turn to China. And I think it just underscored for me the need to take a fresh look at this. And if you have any further comments on what we might be able to do in that regard, I'd appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the question. The BUILD Act gave us eligibility to work in lower income countries, lower middle and upper middle income countries. And that's by income classification from the World Bank, a categorization that the World Bank doesn't even use for their lending. What we think might make more sense is categorization based on the World Bank lending categories, which can take into account countries that haven't yet graduated, that haven't yet found the way to get to a position where commercial finance is the only option.
Well, I think
if we went to that category, Uruguay would become a country that we would be able to operate in.
I think we'll look forward to working with you on taking a more strategic view as opposed to sort of a dogmatic income approach. There's one last thing I'd like to, just a comment, I'd like to have you take a look at it and get back to my team if you might. And that's to take a look at the Hanjin port at Subic Bay in the Philippines, that project. I was deeply involved in that project in my previous role as U.S. Ambassador to Japan. I learned that CCP-affiliated entities were about to buy that shipyard out of bankruptcy. We were able to change that dynamic, put a U.S. private sector company in play for the equity component. The DFC was not able to play as I had imagined they would be able to play. And if you could just take a look at that project with your business perspective and get back to me and tell me what might have changed, and if your tool set had been different, that would have allowed you to play, if I'm asking that in a way that makes sense. I'd really like to just take a hard look at that one lesson that I'm very, very familiar with and understand how an improvement or a modification of your tools could have allowed you to play a more effective role.
I definitely will do that. Seaports are an area of real emphasis for us. Shipyards, too. We just did a deal in Greece. We did a seaport in Ecuador, and we have a couple projects in our pipeline that I hope to be able to announce publicly later in the year that fit exactly the kind of strategic and developmental elements that you just referenced.
Thank you. I'll look forward to hearing back from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Hagerty, for bringing your previous experience and insights, both regionally and sectorally, to the questioning today. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Nathan. I want to start by associating myself with the comments the chairman made at the outset and the comments that the ranking member made at the outset. And I am very concerned about what we saw emerge from the House of Representatives yesterday in terms of their 302B allocations for SFOPs. In my view, that represents a retreat around the world at a time that we need to be more engaged, less engaged. And I hope that, I know this committee has had a bipartisan history in terms of recognizing America's role in the world and the need to use all of our tools to engage around the world, especially when, as you've said, we are competing around the world. We have a good product to offer. China's investments often come with strings that result in bad things happening to those countries. But you can't do this on the cheap. And you can't do it with rhetoric and no resources. So it's going to be really important that we move forward, including the DFC. I want to commend the chairman not only for his role in establishing the DFC, but the legislation that I'm proud to co-sponsor to fix this budgeting issue. It's absolutely nuts to count an equity investment as a pure grant. Nobody in the private sector would think that makes any sense. And since these investments are appropriately public-private partnerships, we want to make sure that our dollars can travel as far as they can. And we're essentially handcuffing you in the DFC when we place that limitation through the budget county rules. I am pleased that yesterday in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I chaired a nomination hearing for someone I hope will be your deputy, Nisha Desai Biswal. I hope we can move that confirmation forward as soon as possible. Let me ask you, Mr. Nathan, about the issue of critical minerals and what role the DFC can play in this area. I appreciated our conversation after you returned from a visit to the Indo-Pacific, including Indonesia. But right now, we know that we are way behind the game when it comes to critical minerals. China has secured access to lots of critical mineral deposits around the world and is the world's largest processor of critical minerals and the world's largest manufacturer of batteries for EVs, which is going to be a very important part of our future and our future competitiveness globally. So can you speak to what kind of projects, investments the DFC has when it comes to securing our supply chain for critical minerals?
Thank you for the question, and thanks for chairing yesterday's nomination hearing. We are the owner of about, I think it's about 12-13% at the moment, of a company called TechMet Limited, which is a U.S.-aligned platform for investing in the mining of critical minerals. We made an initial $25 million investment. We've made a follow-on $30 million equity investment recently so that they could pursue cobalt and nickel mining and processing in a more efficient way than the standard of the industry in Brazil. We're going to have some follow-on projects with them elsewhere in Africa, focused on rare earths and other minerals. There's 2 projects that we're currently working with them on. This is just an example of the difference that equity can make. In these kind of projects, the ability to make equity investments made them possible. We wouldn't have been able to, at the early stage that we were involved, be able to use debt. But we're looking beyond just this relationship. There's a whole series of projects in other rare earths, in critical minerals, in the manufacturing of batteries, and even in graphite. We hope to be able to announce a deal later this year in that regard, graphite being a critical component of being able to manufacture batteries. This supply chain, you're right, is already very much dominated by PRC entities, but we have to begin chipping away at that, at the mining, at the processing, at the manufacturing level.
Well, I appreciate it, and I think right now you're hamstrung a little bit in terms of the rules, because I think we need to do more than chipping away. I mean, I think we need a surge effort in this area, and I look forward to following up on the conversation we're having here. I worry that we, the United States, and even our allies, are perceived in some cases of over-promising and under-delivering. The President and the G7 announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment with the goal of investing $600 billion by, I think, the year 2027, approximately. Can you talk about the DFC's role in that effort and the extent of resources that you're investing at this time?
Yeah. So the areas of priority for DFC dovetail very nicely with the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment and the effort that the G7 is making. Last year, out of our $7.4 billion of transactions, $5.2 billion of those qualified as PGII projects. This is helpful to have this more whole-of-government effort with our interagency partners, but beyond even the U.S. government, our G7 partners are critical in helping amplify the amount of capital available for the kind of private sector investing that we do. Under PGII, we've made a great deal of effort to coordinate with our counterparts in the G7 and more broadly amongst our allies, particularly in Europe and in Asia. By working together, we can create greater efficiency, bring more resources to bear on these projects, and really chip away at what is the thing that I hear constantly, that DFC needs to do more and do it faster. That's our effort, and this is a helpful part of that.
Well, thank you. On the do it faster part, any suggestions you have as to how we can be helpful to you in that, or whether it's internal to the executive branch process? I would welcome any suggestions on that front, because I think moving quickly is obviously very important in this global environment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your persistent interest and engagement on this issue and on the balance between development and strategic priorities. Senator Bozeman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Senator Graham for holding this very important hearing. We appreciate you, Mr. Nathan, for being here and all that you're doing. You've got a big job. I know in your testimony you mentioned that the DFC has surged its efforts in the food and agricultural sector. Food security is national security for all of our countries, and that you continue to actively look for more viable projects to support. Can you tell us what types of projects has the DFC supported in improving food security in developing countries?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Particularly after Russia's illegal and brutal war on Ukraine, the issue of food security globally has become even more critical and highlighted. It's been one of the reasons why we've surged our effort, had a special focus on it. Our projects are often small in this area because they're targeted at smallholder farmers, at rural communities, at finding ways to bring products to market more quickly, eliminating layers of middlemen. We've invested in companies that provide technology and financing to smallholder farmers. We've made investments with banks that then target their lending activity toward farming and agricultural businesses. I visited when I was in Georgia, in the Republic of Georgia. I visited cold chain logistics companies that we've invested in, that help produce not spoil and get to market more quickly. I think there are a range of things we can do in aquaculture, in Asia, and in other activities focused on really bringing the farmer more directly to market.
Very good. No, that's so important. Little things that are huge things, getting countries, the regions, just the world food price, as opposed to, not having the competition, is so important.
If I could add, even something like our investment in Yilport in Puerto Bolivar in Ecuador, a Pacific deep water container port, that has a food security element to it because that helps Ecuador be more efficient in exporting bananas and their primary agricultural commodity to the rest of the world. So infrastructure is a critical component to also helping to promote food security.
Right, very good. Speaking of infrastructure, I know that DFC is focusing on working with the private sector to promote infrastructure investment in an effort to offer a good alternative to Chinese predatory lending. Can you elaborate on the specific actions the DFC has done to reduce Chinese predatory lending in developing countries and what it intends to do moving forward?
Well, Senator, we need to show up and offer a choice. That's the best way to compete. If we have a flow of deals, if we have the financing tools available to us, if we have the workforce and capacity to process those deals quickly and to generate more deal flow and deal with clients, that's how we're going to be able to properly compete with China. I can think of some recent examples of investments that we've made that are helpful in that. Our board approved earlier this year our financial support for the expansion of an airport in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is one of the poorest countries in the world. Anything we can do to help connect them to their region, to the world, to help their economy. We're also financing the building of a power plant in Sierra Leone. This is a country with an extremely low level of electricity penetration. That's a key to development. At the moment, the capital city, Freetown, is dependent on diesel generators on a barge that are owned by a Turkish businessman. It's unreliable, it's inefficient, it's unhealthy. By financing the construction of a power plant, we're helping them have greater energy security and promote development.
In the '24 budget, the State Department has a lot of money for infrastructure, ports, things like you're describing. Do you all work together?
Yeah, we work very closely with our interagency partners. The Secretary of State is the chair of our board. We rely on posts around the world to help us with sourcing deals, with the vetting of our partners, with our Know Your Customer rules. The State Department helps us with thinking about certification for the strategic importance of our deals. And like with all of our interagency partners, USAID, Treasury Department, Commerce, we work closely to help get our projects through the process more quickly and to generate as many good ideas as we can for potential future transactions.
And as far as critical entities like biotechnology, are you emphasizing things like that, or how does that work?
One of our priority areas is healthcare. Helping developing countries build more resilient health systems is an important element of that. That can include therapeutic clinics, but it could also be involved in the manufacturing of vaccines or pharmaceuticals, the distribution of medicines to rural and underserved communities. Those are the kind of opportunities that we're looking at.
Very good. Well, thank you. We appreciate you and your staff's hard work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Senator Bozeman. Thank you for your great partnership and development work in Africa and around the world over now so many years together. I think we've done this 13 years together. It's hard to believe, but thank you for coming today. If I might, while we wait to see if there's one more member who wants to join us, I'm going to ask a few more follow-up questions. I am specifically interested in vaccine production. One of the things that was striking to me about the arc of the global pandemic was that we faced a moment where vaccine nationalism emerged, and a number of countries in Europe and the United States prioritized the development of abundant available vaccines for their own population before meeting pledges that had been made to the developing world, partly because of developments in India. But it opened a critical window where both China and Russia offered vaccines that were less effective on complex terms that were often not favorable to the recipient country. And there was a 6 to 9 month period where I received dozens of pointed and sometimes desperate calls from heads of state pressing for access to vaccine technology. Vaccines are an important part of human development and public health. We are also likely at some point in our lives to face a comparable global pandemic. I'm wondering what initiatives have been taken to provide some investment or financing, or whether that's credible, in places around the developing world so that there's a more distributed global network of vaccine manufacturing.
Thank you, Senator. DFC, this was before I was there, but DFC pivoted and directed a huge amount of energy toward responding to the global pandemic. That did include supporting efforts for distributed vaccine manufacturing in Senegal, in South Africa, and in India. But now that the current pandemic has seemed to fade from the top of people's attention, we can't divert our focus from preparing for the next pandemic. Part of that is building resilient healthcare systems, and just the underlying development of countries, I think, is critical to that. But specifically on vaccines, we are looking at broadening some of the investments that we previously made to be beyond COVID-19 response vaccines, but instead be funding available for a broader approach for the basic sort of health of societies, for children and for development. We worked with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. We provided them with a revolver in order to place orders for vaccines prior to donor nation commitments coming in. And we're working with them again to think about how to reimagine that relationship to be broader in the way that you exactly referred to.
I'd appreciate your keeping up with me on that development. One of the things we imagined when writing the BUILD Act was that having equity investment capabilities would also improve syndicating capabilities, partnering early stage with DFCs from the Nordic countries, from Japan, from South Korea, from our European partners. How is that proceeding? What are the limitations on it? Are there any additional supports you need, either for the interagency or in terms of your funding or legal authorities, that would help make that real?
It's clear that that was one of the goals behind the BUILD Act, and we've worked hard to fulfill this. And I think we're doing a good job. There's a lot of work ahead, though. Part of that is direct coordination. We've had numerous meetings with our counterparts at multiple levels, my level and at staff level, to find ways that we can get efficiencies on due diligence, on deal sharing. This has been a productive activity. There are some examples of specific frameworks that I think could produce great results. One is focused on Ukraine, and I don't want to get ahead of an announcement, but we announced in Japan during the G7 a collaboration between EBRD, DFC, and the other DFIs in the G7, and I think there's opportunities to broaden this out. Another is a deal that I mentioned in my opening statement, which, along with our Japanese and Australian counterparts, we were able to fund the acquisition of digital assets in the South Pacific. These assets had received an unsolicited offer from a Chinese firm. It was important to the Australians, and as a result, clearly strategically important to the Japanese and to us to support that effort. I think there's a lot more things like that we can do. It includes also some of the MDBs. So we're working closely with Inter-American Development Bank, with the EBRD, and others to find ways to share deal flow, to get more efficiencies and make greater impact.
As there is more and more conversation, and there's been some actions to revise the World Bank, its risk tolerance, its structure, its prioritization, similarly in the IMF, I'll be interested to have you keep me and others on this subcommittee up to date about that work in terms of the syndication. Two other quick questions, if I can, then I'll turn to my friend and colleague, Senator Merkley. I think countering corruption is an absolutely critical part of what you're doing. I'd welcome any input on how the offerings that you're making allow leaders in developing countries to not just have more transparency, better labor standards, better technology and skill transfer, but to push back on corruption, and what other supports or partnership you need from either State Department, more broadly, federal law enforcement, the private sector, to strengthen that piece of what you're bringing to the table. Because often the conversation about a large infrastructure project in a foreign country is complex. And there's some elements of a government that stand to benefit politically and professionally, and others that may stand to benefit personally. And those are very fraught conversations for a potential bidder, an American contractor, to engage in, and it requires subtle and complex conversations. How are we doing at bringing the best of your capabilities in terms of countering corruption to the fore?
Thanks for the question. I believe that our adherence to high standards is one of our competitive advantages, actually. I think you're exactly right that by having a commitment to high standards, labor, social, environmental, and integrity standards, it gives countries an opportunity to fight corruption, to highlight the problems they have, to contrast a difference. We work closely with Post. Our colleagues at embassies are critical for helping inform our work on many questions, but particularly this one. We work closely with the intelligence community for our KYC, our Know Your Customer, and other due diligence activities for vetting our potential partners. We have very high standards, and occasionally that means we have to pass on a deal, but more often than not, it means that we're able to improve the structure of a deal, the partners we deal with, and provide an example in the countries where we operate, where working with the private sector, we can really set the tone in the way that you said.
As we approach the 5th anniversary of the DFC next year, I'm interested in how you monitor that. Our ability to go around the world and say, we've got this great new tool, it's got great resources, it's delivering, is going to be tested. Folks will look back at some of the projects that have been financed and say, did they in fact meet higher labor standards, higher skilled transfer, and higher transparency. How are you monitoring the outcomes of projects? And as you know, unfortunately, all too often, in looking across a big portfolio, critics or the media are inclined to pull out one or two out of hundreds of projects that may have failed to meet the projected goals. How are you monitoring the actual implementation on the ground over these 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. Mistakes do happen, and we need to be prepared to handle them well. That's what makes the difference, right? By being open and transparent, by having process internally and externally for dealing with that. That's the key to mitigating the damage that a mistake or some future problem could have. You know, this is one of the things that the resources that this committee has provided us with has really helped bolster. Our Office of Development Policy is actually the biggest area in DFC. That's where our investment monitoring it takes place. We don't just need to do screening and analysis of the development impact and all of the various standard concerns we have before making the investment. We need to stay engaged and measure in precisely the way that you're mentioning. And when things happen, if we didn't catch them, we still need to have a mechanism, whether it's our public accountability mechanism, our openness with our Office of Inspector General, or other channels with our interagency partners, to make sure that when deals go in a direction that we wouldn't have wanted, that we handle that as effectively and proactively as possible.
I look forward to staying in touch with you about that, because anyone who's supervised a large portfolio of projects knows there's always a tail, there's always a few that go sideways. But as you said, exactly how you monitor, how you respond, and then how you change policies and practices are critical. Senator Merkley, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Nathan, for coming in and sharing your insights. I want to focus on the DFC's role in supporting fossil fuel projects. The report from April 21 through March 22 had $217 million directed towards fossil fuel projects. When is DFC going to quit financing all fossil fuel projects?
So, Senator, there are situations where the funding of fossil fuel projects is within our mandate. For example, in response to Russia's brutal war on Ukraine, and under the European Energy Security and Diversification Act, we have increased our effort to find projects in Central Europe that help with energy security. We provided $400 million in political risk insurance to an entity that is providing gas in Moldova so that they can diversify away from their dependence on Gazprom. This is in response to the emergency situation that Moldova was in because of the war in Ukraine. Furthermore, and I referenced it earlier, DFC is currently financing the building of a gas-fired power plant, a small one, 83 megawatts, in Sierra Leone. This project is highly developmental in a country that is incredibly poor, where providing access to electricity is a critical component of development. And while the major emphasis for DFC in providing access to electricity is in providing renewables, solar, geothermal, wind, we're looking at many nuclear projects. In some circumstances where there's no alternative and a highly developmental situation that can help bring a country out of poverty, we'll still consider those situations.
Yeah. Well, I would suggest that you're missing the bigger picture. The amount of fossils that can be burned and by humankind across the globe and keep us below 1.5 degrees centigrade is microscopic now. And all the identified projects around the world already account for more than 2 times the amount that can be burned and keep us below 1.5, and 40% more than will keep us below 2 degrees. And yet here we are continuing to promote one project after another For example, DFC supporting the LNG pipeline and project in Vietnam, the DFC supporting the project in Mozambique, and supporting intermediaries that are supporting fossil fuel projects. And I think it was called the 3 Cs initiative. So here we are at a situation where my state's burning up. We have a national Paris commitment. We have a notional understanding that we need to get to zero. We're building more fossil fuel projects. And yes, I certainly understand that you can create jobs in the fossil fuel world. But I recall this conversation with the energy minister in New Delhi. And this occurred during actually a trip that Chris and I were on together, and I did a little side trip to meet with him. We had had a conversation with the legislators from India at the Paris talks in 2015, and he was intent on developing some 40 new coal plants. And the gist of it was, I asked him, what does it cost for a new kilowatt hour of coal? And he said 7 cents, about 7 cents. I said, how about for a new kilowatt hour of solar energy? And he said about 2 to 3 cents. And I said, and those costs don't reflect what's outside your window. And he looked outside his window, but he couldn't really see anything because of the pollution from burning coal. And you take into the health impacts, then the discrepancy was not 7 cents versus 2 cents. It was some much larger number. And so the world is at this crisis point, and yet the DFC is doing exactly what we have to not do. And there seems to be a philosophy deeply embedded in the organization that somehow fossil gas is better for the climate than fossil coal. And that's simply scientifically untrue. In its life cycle, because methane is such a heat collector, it is as bad as coal. Now, it's a very powerful organization, the fossil fuel world, but we have the biggest challenge ever presented to humanity in terms of the devastation we're doing to this planet, and the DFC has blinders on and is continuing to support all these fossil projects. And there may be super rare exceptions, but even in a situation where there has been war, it's an opportunity to rebuild not on the old model, but on a new model of renewable energy with wind and solar. And in other places, for example, in the Rift Valley of Africa, tremendous opportunity for geothermal. Yeah. So DFC could be a leader on the pathway the world has to take, or they can be anchoring us to exactly the wrong strategy that puts us deeply invested in fossil gas for a generation to come. That is my concern. I really think it's time to say that DFC has to rethink this strategy, doing far more harm than good, and think about how those rising temperatures are devastating our coastlines, devastating our forests, devastating our groundwater, producing more powerful storms, devastating cities across America. All those are impacts that have to be taken into account too. And those effects, by the way, are not just in America, they're all over the world. And if we talk about development in Africa, the expanding drought and climate impacts in Africa are having enormous impact. The climate impacts in Central America are a major driving force of lost bean and corn harvests, driving people in the cities where people cannot find work, where they're subject to drug cartels, and they're coming north to our border. And so, while it may look like creating some significant number of jobs here or solving a short-term crisis there, it is really time to rethink this underlying strategy.
Thank you, Senator. I think our area of disagreement is actually pretty small. I think there's large agreement between us. Finding ways of addressing the climate crisis is a priority for DFC. Last year, we did $2.4 billion of climate-linked investments. Last week, our board approved a $144 million loan to a company in Ecuador called Solar Romo to build a 200-megawatt on-grid solar plant that will be the cheapest electricity in Ecuador. So I completely agree with you on that. We're engaged in diversifying the solar panel supply chain for manufacturing from PRC so that it's easier to do development of solar projects. Even in Ukraine, we're currently considering providing political risk insurance to a number of wind projects, which when I was there, I've been there several times this year, these projects are still under construction in the western part of the country. So this is a huge emphasis from e-mobility to geothermal, wind, solar, nuclear for us. It's the rare exception that you mentioned. Some of the projects you mentioned, I think, are not actually projects that we're doing. There is no LNG pipeline in Vietnam that DFC is financing. The Mozambique project was initiated in 2020. Our major emphasis is in the areas that you mentioned.
Well, let's talk Vietnam for a moment.
Yeah.
The Saigon Times reported January 14, 23, that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation were going to help Vietnam's decarbonization by financing transition to LNG. And while the details were not published, the assumption is that's supporting the Chan Mani LNG project, a 4,000 megawatt gas-fired power project. The Energy Transition Partnership found that Vietnam can transition to clean energy without any new LNG development. Transitioning to LNG is not decarbonization.
Yeah. So I don't know what that article is referring to. I mean, I just have to be frank about that.
Okay, we'll explore that and see if that was a typo in the article. But it's a type of thing that certainly concerns me. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. And thank you for your persistent engagement on critical issues that matter to all of us. Thank you, Mr. Nathan. I appreciate your testimony today. I look forward to staying in close touch. You've had a wide range of questions from a wide range of members of the subcommittee, which I hope reflects the degree of interest across many of us. The common theme is that we want to see the DFC succeed and be strategic and be effective and help with development and help with the United States' overarching strategic goals. So I look forward to continuing our conversation and appreciate your valuable input. This hearing record will remain open for written questions until 5 p.m. on Wednesday, June 21st. And with that, thank you. This hearing is adjourned.